Fyodor Dostoevsky did not have a kind view of intellectuals. But is that really the case? Yes, it seems so. Still, wasn't Dostoevsky an intellectual himself? In some ways, yes, and that's part of what makes it interesting. But before we get deeper, let's first understand what the word intellectual means. Here's a simple comparison. A shopkeeper buys products from others and sells them to many customers. An intellectual does something similar, but instead of selling things, they spread ideas. You could say intellectuals are like sellers of ideas. This is what sets them apart from philosophers. A philosopher is more like an inventor who creates something new or makes a deep discovery. The intellectual, on the other hand, shares ideas that often come from others, kind of like a business person shares products they didn't make. So how do we know Dostoevsky didn't like intellectuals? The best way to find out is by reading his books. In many of his stories, the characters who struggle the most, or cause the most trouble, are intellectuals. But wait, didn't Dostoevsky write characters who were complex and human, not simple villains? That's true. His characters are never just good or bad. They're deep, with good parts and bad parts. Even so, the ones with the greatest flaws, the ones who seem most lost or harmful, are usually intellectuals, and quite often, they're men. Raskolnikov, the main character in Crime and Punishment, is someone who lets his thoughts and ideas lead him into terrible actions. He talks himself into committing a murder. Ivan Karamazov is another character who questions everything around him, including God and morality. In Demons, there are several characters who are also driven by strong ideas, and they try to start a revolution. In Dostoevsky's stories, these characters, who are often intellectuals, don't usually meet good ends. Many of them either lose their minds or are sent away to harsh places like Siberia. In a way, Dostoevsky's books reflect parts of his own life. He was sent to Siberia too because of his early involvement in political and intellectual groups. Let's look at what was going on in history at the time. In the middle of the 1800s, young men from wealthy Russian families were often taught in French, German, and English. Because of that, they looked up to Europe and wanted to bring in Western ideas such as atheism, socialism, utilitarianism, liberalism, and individualism. But many of those ideas were different from the teachings of the Russian Orthodox Church, which focused on faith, kindness, generosity, and caring for others. These educated young people also wanted to free the serfs. At the time, most of the ordinary people in Russia were tied to the land and had very few rights. They lived under the control of powerful landowners. The young Russian thinkers were inspired by what happened in France, where people had risen up against their king not long before, and they wanted to create big changes in their own country too. Dostoevsky was taught in French during his youth, and this made him deeply curious about new ideas from Europe. He became so interested that he joined a group of radical thinkers called the Petrashevsky Circle. Because of this involvement, he was arrested in 1849. At the time, Dostoevsky was just beginning to build his career as a writer. But then, everything changed. He was taken to be executed by a firing squad, and for a few moments, he believed his life was about to end. He later wrote about this terrifying moment in great detail in his novel, The Idiot. However, the execution was staged. It was meant to frighten him and the others. Instead of being killed, Dostoevsky was sent to a prison camp in Siberia. There he came face to face with the real heart of Russia, the peasants and everyday workers who lived without education or wealth. It was the first time he truly saw how different their lives were from his own. Before that, in the city of St. Petersburg, he had lived in a world that mostly admired Europe and didn't pay much attention to what was happening in the rest of the country. Life in Siberia was bitterly cold and full of hard labor. But what affected him the most wasn't the weather or the work. It was the people he was forced to live with. He wrote about this painful experience, saying, "I came to know a kind of suffering that might be the most intense and unbearable in a prison, aside from losing freedom itself. I mean, being forced to live closely with people who are impossible to live with. I believe every prisoner, even without realizing it, has suffered from this." Dostoevsky, once a nobleman and a well-educated man, was now surrounded by people from all across Russia. many of them criminals, many of them violent. He had to share space with them, sleep near them, and work alongside them. The cold and physical hardship were terrible, but what left the deepest mark was being so close to human pain, cruelty, and despair every single day. Dostoevsky's hardest struggle in the prison camp was learning how to live among the other prisoners. A few were educated like him, but most were not. Many were common criminals, uneducated, loud, rude, and sometimes very dangerous. Dostoevsky, who had never been in such a place before, was suddenly living in a crowded and harsh space filled with some of the roughest men in all of Russia. He wrote about these experiences in his well-known book, The House of the Dead. Because he was a careful observer, he paid close attention to how different the everyday Russian people were from the intellectuals he knew in St. Petersburg. And this brings us to one of the main reasons why Dostoevsky felt frustrated with intellectuals. In his eyes, they didn't truly understand the lives of the poor. When things got difficult, these intellectuals often stood closer to the wealthy than to the people they claimed to support. They had little in common with the working class and didn't seem to want real connection with them. Dostoevsky noticed that these thinkers often disliked being near peasants. They looked down on the way the poor spoke, the way they dressed, and even the way they smelled. And the peasants, in return, didn't trust the intellectuals either. To them, these men seemed like part of the upper class, not like friends or supporters. Though the intellectuals spoke of justice and freedom, they still lived lives full of foreign habits. They read European writers, smoked cigars from Cuba, drank wine from France, and enjoyed food from Germany and England. They admired European lifestyles but stayed far from Russian traditions. They didn't wear Russian clothes, didn't eat Russian meals, and didn't value the Russian way of life. The only thing they shared with their country was the blood in their bodies, but not the heart of its culture. The intellectuals longed for everything European, but the things that Russian peasants held most dear were often rejected or looked down upon by them. The peasants valued strong family ties, their orthodox faith, a deep sense of responsibility, and even the idea of feeling guilty when they had done something wrong. These values helped them stay grounded and connected to their way of life. But the intellectuals didn't want any of that. They wanted freedom from tradition, and they didn't see much worth in the beliefs that guided most of the common people. Because of this, Dostoevsky came to believe that many intellectuals were not truly standing with the poor, even if they said they were. He saw them as people who pretended to care, but didn't really share the same heart. In his eyes, they were acting, putting on a mask of kindness, but not being honest about who they were or what they wanted. This made them seem like hypocrites. Now we come to another reason why Dostoevsky struggled with the idea of the intellectual. It had to do with taking responsibility. In stories, we often care deeply for characters who are kind and selfless. These characters may not always be clever, but they try hard to do what's right, even when it's hard for them or makes their life more difficult. But Dostoevsky noticed that many intellectuals were different. Because they relied so much on their logic and thinking, they often became self-centered. They were quick to protect themselves and slow to admit when they had done something wrong. When bad things happened, they blamed others. It was the ruler's fault, or the government's fault, or their past. Rarely did they look inward and say, "I was part of the problem." That unwillingness to be accountable made them hard to trust. In many of his stories, Dostoevsky challenges his thoughtful, idea-driven characters to face the truth of their own actions. These characters often argue, avoid, and explain things away. They blame others and try hard to make sense of what they've done using reason alone. But in the end, Dostoevsky always leads them to the same point. They must accept that they are responsible for what they've done. To Dostoevsky, a dangerous idea is like a sickness that takes hold of the mind. Once it's there, it's hard to shake off. We see this clearly in Crime and Punishment. Most of the book shows Raskolnikov struggling to admit to the wrong he's done. He keeps trying to make his crime sound reasonable, even noble. He goes back and forth, trying to convince himself and others that what he did was right. But in the end, he realizes something important. Logic alone can't quiet a guilty heart. No matter how many times he tries to explain away his actions, he cannot silence his conscience. During his time in Siberia, Dostoevsky found himself full of dislike toward the people he was imprisoned with. Many of them were harsh, rough, and without any manners. At first, he couldn't believe he was part of the same group. He felt completely different from them. But as time passed, his views started to change. He began to notice the human side of these men. He saw how many of them accepted the fact that they had done wrong. Why did they take responsibility more easily than the educated people Dostoevsky had known? Because they didn't overthink their actions. They didn't try to explain their behavior in fancy ways. They simply admitted what they had done. And most of all, they didn't complain much about their punishment. They didn't cry out about unfairness. Instead, they accepted their situation because deep down, they knew they had caused harm. This experience taught Dostoevsky something powerful. Accepting guilt without excuses might be more honest and human than trying to escape it with clever words. They took responsibility. Not all of them felt sorry, but they didn't try to hide what they had done. Their honesty helped Dostoevsky realize something simple but important. Something he and many other educated thinkers often missed: telling the truth. This leads us to the third reason Dostoevsky saw intellectuals as deeply flawed. They weren't truthful, not just with other people, but with themselves as well. How do people twist reality to fit what they want to believe? They often use tricks. In nature, many animals have ways of hiding from danger or looking more powerful or attractive than they are. Humans do the same thing. We use things like clothes, makeup, or shiny objects to seem more impressive than we might actually be. An old Chinese book called The Art of War by Sun Tzu teaches many clever ways to outsmart enemies in battle. These same ideas are even used in business today. But how does this connect to Russian thinkers? Dostoevsky's issue wasn't only about hiding the truth. What upset him most was how quickly these intellectuals gave up on their own beliefs when things got hard. He showed this clearly in Crime and Punishment. After Raskolnikov commits murder, he becomes sick with a fever. Ivan Karamazov, another character in a different story, falls apart as soon as life gets difficult. Long ago, heroes were known for being brave, honest, and strong, even when it meant putting themselves at risk. But these modern intellectuals, who said they stood up for the poor and the weak, didn't act with courage or honor when it really mattered. After coming back from Siberia in the 1860s, Dostoevsky went on a journey through Europe. After his visit to France, he wrote something very powerful. He said that Western people often talk about brotherhood as if it's something that can magically bring people together. But he believed real brotherhood has to already exist in people's hearts. It can't just be a wish or an idea. In French and Western cultures in general, he felt this deep connection wasn't there. Instead, he saw a focus on the self, on being separate, on protecting one's own interests, on personal success, and on being in charge of one's own life. Everyone was taught to think of themselves as completely alone, standing apart from nature and other people, as if they were the center of everything. Dostoevsky began to realize that many educated thinkers didn't live in the real world. They spent most of their time in thought, sitting comfortably at desks. Their biggest storm was a thought storm. Their closest battle might be with a spider in the bathroom. And their biggest disaster, a coffee cup tipping over. Of course, Dostoevsky didn't say those exact things. But his time in the prison camp showed him clearly that many Russian intellectuals had a very limited idea of what real life was like. They lived inside a soft world of books and dreams about a perfect future. And in some ways, they got what they wanted. About 40 years after Dostoevsky died, the Russian intellectuals finally brought about the revolution they dreamed of, and the country became a socialist state for 70 years. These new leaders believed in something called materialism. That means they trusted logic, science, and facts to decide what mattered in life. Feelings, faith, and traditions were seen as less important than reasoning things out with the mind alone. This leads us to the last reason Dostoevsky struggled with intellectuals: reason itself. If you had to explain his biggest issue with them in one word, it would be rationality. Intellectuals believed that reason was a perfect gift, the best and only way to live life. After traveling through Europe in the 1860s, including a stop at London's Crystal Palace, a place that showed off the newest science and inventions, Dostoevsky wrote a book called Winter Notes on Summer Impressions. In it, he shared his deep worry. Reason by itself isn't enough. People need more than logic. If we live only by reason, we can become selfish, cold, and even feel like life has no meaning. He explored this idea more in his novel Notes from Underground. In that story, the main character, known as the Underground Man, is deeply hurt by society and overwhelmed by logic. He even refuses to go to the doctor for his sick lungs. His pain is so deep that he chooses to stay hidden, living in darkness. He becomes so wrapped up in thoughts that he loses his grip on what matters. Dostoevsky wanted to show that modern ways of thinking can push people into lonely places, into basements, behind desks, stuck in front of screens, cut off from the world like machines. So what can we take from this today? Can Dostoevsky still teach us something? Yes, he can. One big change now is that many of us live with these same ideas he once saw in only a small group. 150 years ago, these thoughts were mostly shared by scholars and thinkers. Today, they're everywhere. These days, it feels like everyone acts like an intellectual. Many of us blame others when things go wrong. Many of us say one thing and do another, both online and in real life. But reading Dostoevsky and his stories can help us see things more clearly. How? He brings us back to what's real. You don't need to go through something extreme like a Siberian prison to learn what he did. You can simply step out of your room and take a walk in your neighborhood. Pay attention to how people live. Watch workers building things. Try talking to them if it feels right. That kind of experience helps you feel connected to real life. Dostoevsky also reminds us how important it is to take responsibility. Some modern speakers, like Mr. Peterson, talk a lot about this now. But Dostoevsky showed it in his books. He showed that taking responsibility doesn't trap you. It actually sets you free. Often, the fear of being responsible feels scarier than the responsibility itself. It's like being more afraid of a test than the test really deserves. But when you step up, that fear starts to fade. Another big lesson from Dostoevsky is to not be a constant consumer. That means, don't buy too many things that you don't need. It can hurt your money situation, but also, don't keep filling your mind with too many thoughts and ideas all at once. That can make your thinking confused and your heart uneasy. Clear thinking is one of the most valuable things you can have. If you take in too much, your mind might get cloudy. So, spend time outside, enjoy nature, talk to people face to face, and live in the world, not just inside your head. That's how people lived for thousands of years. Maybe we can learn something from them. What do you think? Feel free to share your thoughts. Thanks so much for listening.